The Role and Authority of the Senate. Pastcast Channel's new episode. The Senate as the architect of war decisions in Rome. The political structure of the Roman Republic was built upon a system of balance and oversight far ahead of its time. At the center of this system stood the Senate, grounded in ancient traditions, political experience, and aristocratic prestige. Although not directly elected by the people, the Senate wielded broad influence over foreign affairs, internal administration, financial policy, and particularly decisions related to war. In matters as vital as declarations of war, the Senate played a decisive and even directive role. This illustrates how, in Rome, power was exercised not merely through the sword, but through intellect and law, legal authority and political legitimacy. During the Republic, the authority to declare war technically belonged to the popular assemblies, especially the Comitia Centuriata. However, in practice, this power was largely exercised in line with the Senate's guiding decisions. The assemblies lacked access to diplomatic intelligence or military strategy. The capacity to gather information, conduct analysis, and formulate proposals lay within the Senate. The Senate would debate the political implications of external threats, assess their impact on Rome's interests, and issue a recommendation regarding the necessity of war. This recommendation would typically be recorded as a Senatus Consultum, Senate decree. Although these decisions were not legally binding, Roman tradition dictated that the assemblies largely followed the Senate's guidance. Thus, while the Senate did not possess legislative power in the strictest sense, it functioned as the foundational political institution that granted legal and moral legitimacy to critical processes such as declaring war. In some periods, popular assemblies served as little more than ceremonial bodies, with real decisions being made behind the closed doors of the Senate. Diplomatic intelligence and the pursuit of peace. The Senate's role in declaring war was not limited to making military decisions. On the contrary, one of the Senate's core responsibilities was to objectively assess whether war was necessary and to prioritize peaceful resolutions whenever possible. War would only be considered if diplomacy and treaties had been exhausted. Therefore, in the early stages of potential conflict, the Senate would dispatch diplomatic missions or present formal demands, attempting to resolve the issue without violence. Only when these initiatives failed would war be deemed an appropriate course of action. In conducting these diplomatic efforts, the Senate sought both to preserve Rome's honor and to ensure that any war undertaken was morally and religiously justified, and iustum bellum, or just war. In this way, the Senate underscored that war was not merely a tool of conquest, but a moral and political decision with far-reaching implications. Balancing power, relationship with the consuls. The Senate functioned not only as an analytical body in the process of declaring war, but also as a guiding and supervisory authority. Executive power in Rome was vested in two annually elected consuls. However, in crucial matters like war, these consuls depended heavily on the Senate's direction and counsel. The Senate decided which consul would be assigned to which front, designated which provinces would be declared theaters of war, and in some cases, granted extraordinary powers to specific generals. This system provided a vital balance of power, especially during wartime, preventing the unchecked accumulation of executive authority. By maintaining oversight over the duration, cost, and outcomes of conflicts, the Senate ensured democratic accountability in the conduct of war. In this sense, war decisions were not made on the basis of personal ambition or emotional reaction, but were filtered through the lens of institutional rationality. Expansion of power in times of crisis. In extraordinary circumstances, the Roman Senate could extend its authority beyond constitutional limits to issue emergency decisions. In such cases, a decree known as the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, final decree of the Senate, was passed, temporarily granting consuls full state powers. If enemy forces attacked Roman territory or internal uprisings erupted, this decree enabled the Senate to act swiftly and decisively without waiting for the assembly's approval. However, the abuse of this extraordinary power contributed to political instability and the erosion of the Republic in its final century. Leaders such as Sulla and Julius Caesar exploited this mechanism to consolidate personal power. Nevertheless, this practice also highlights how crucial the Senate was to crisis management in Rome. The institution at the heart of decision-making. In the process of declaring war, the Roman Senate was far more than an advisory council. It was the institution where state intelligence, political foresight, and legal legitimacy converged. One of its most critical functions was to ensure that Rome's wars were accepted as legitimate not only by its own people, but also by the gods, its generals, and its allies. In this capacity, the Senate became not only the engine of Roman military expansion, but also the moral and political conscience of the Republic. Through its decisions, it helped shape the destiny of an empire. The religious dimension of declaring war, official rights, waging war with the gods' approval, the quest for divine legitimacy in Rome. In ancient Rome, war was not merely a political or military act. It had to be a decision aligned with the will of the gods. Roman religious doctrine required divine approval for critical matters such as declarations of war. Therefore, no war could be initiated arbitrarily. At this point, the official priests and the rituals they performed played a crucial role in grounding Roman warfare in moral and religious legitimacy. These rites transformed declarations of war into actions that were not only political, but also cosmically sanctioned. Jus dum bellum. The just war doctrine. In Rome, it was not enough for a war to be based on legitimate reasons. It also had to be justified in the eyes of the gods. This understanding was expressed through the concept of jus dum bellum, a just war. Rome did not engage in war unless it was defending its own borders or responding to aggression founded on clear justifications. Thus, before declaring war, the Roman state sought to demonstrate its moral high ground and divine favor through specific religious rituals. The most important of these was the official declaration of war, conducted by the official priests. Who were the official priests? Official priests, fetial, were a specialized group of clergy among the many religious orders in Rome. Their primary role was to ensure that Rome's diplomatic relations with other communities were conducted according to divine laws. In times of war or peace, the fetiales represented the sacred morality of Rome. They were not merely ceremonial figures, but spiritual authorities who safeguarded Rome's covenant with the gods. These priests were typically chosen from noble families and received formal religious training. The leader of this group was known as the Pater Patratus, who held the most important responsibilities during the war declaration process. Stages of the official rites. When the Roman Senate considered declaring war against a foreign power, diplomatic solutions were sought first. In this process, official priests followed several ritualistic steps. Diplomatic engagement. The official priests would send an envoy to the leaders or official representatives of the enemy state. This delegation would present Rome's demands, such as cessation of hostilities, restitution of damages, or respect for allies, and grant a 30-day period for compliance. During this time, the enemy was given a fair chance to restore peace. Appeal to the gods in case of violation. If the enemy failed to meet these demands, official priests would present the matter before the gods. In doing so, the enemy state was seen as having committed a transgression against the divine order. Rome, on the other hand, positioned itself as a protector of cosmic justice. the war declaration ritual. If the demands were ultimately rejected, the official priests would proceed to the borders of the enemy territory. There, the Pater Patratus would recite a solemn prayer and ceremoniously hurl a sacred spear into the enemy land, proclaiming, "In the witness of Mars, god of war, we commence this war for just causes." This ritual symbolized that the war declaration was divinely approved and consistent with the sacred order. This act of casting the spear was the spiritual and symbolic apex of a Roman declaration of war, the inseparable link between religion and state. In Rome, the concepts of state and religion were inseparable. A successful war could not be won through military strategy alone. It also required the support of the gods. Before Roman armies embarked on a campaign, they performed sacrifices, consulted omens, and prayed for victory. Yet the foundation of all these efforts was the religious legitimacy obtained through the official rites. Without the gods' approval, a war was seen as doomed to failure and misfortune. Thus, official priests were not just religious officials. They were guardians of Rome's universal order. Their ceremonies demonstrated that war was not merely a political instrument, but also the execution of a sacred covenant with the gods. Prayer before the sword, justice before power. The official rites reveal how deeply Roman warfare was intertwined with structure, discipline, and spiritual accountability. Rome sought to conquer not only through military prowess, but also by asserting moral superiority and religious legitimacy. In this regard, Roman wars were not merely about territorial expansion, but expressions of a divine order manifest on earth. Ultimately, the religious dimension of declaring war proves that Rome, even as it rose to superpower status, remained a civilization anchored in law, tradition, and reverence for the gods. The official rites are one of the most striking examples of how spirituality and politics were interwoven in the ascent of this great empire. Approval of the People's Assembly, Comitia Centuriata. The voice of the Republic, the Roman people's participation in war decisions. The ancient Roman Republic built a system that placed great importance on the participation of the people in political decision-making mechanisms. Although the aristocratic Senate stood out as the guiding mind of the state, the legal legitimacy of vital decisions, such as going to war, was ensured through assemblies representing the people. In this context, the Comitia Centuriata, or Assembly of the Centuries, played a decisive role in the final stage of such a serious decision as declaring war. The approval of this assembly was not merely a legal procedure, but also an expression of the collective will of the Roman citizens. What is the Comitia Centuriata? The Comitia Centuriata was one of the most important popular assemblies of the Roman Republic. Established in the 6th century BCE by Servius Tullius, this assembly was organized based on units called centuries, which grouped Roman citizens according to their wealth and social status. Each century had one vote in the assembly. There were approximately 193 centuries in total, and decisions were made by majority vote. While this system theoretically aimed to provide equal representation for all citizens, in practice the votes of the wealthy classes were more influential. Because wealthier citizens were grouped into fewer centuries, their votes carried greater weight. Therefore, the Comitia Centuriata was designed to balance the interests of both the people and the aristocracy. The legal role of Comitia Centuriata in war decisions. In the Roman Republic, the legal authority to declare war belonged to the Comitia Centuriata. Although the Senate made guiding decisions based on political wisdom and experience, the legal basis for such decisions required approval from this assembly representing the people. In other words, to initiate a war, a lex de bello gerendo, law on conducting war, had to be passed, and this law was voted on in the Comitia Centuriata. This practice demonstrated that war in Rome was not just the decision of an elite group, but a decision taken by the collective will of society. Especially since the majority of soldiers who would participate in the war had voting rights in this assembly, it ensured that those directly affected by the decision were involved in the process. Legitimacy and social support. The approval of the Comitia Centuriata was not only a legal necessity, but also the foundation of social legitimacy. Including the people in the decision to go to war meant that the state sought the consent not only of its rulers, but also of its ruled. This participation made it easier for the people to support the army during wartime, volunteer for military service, and accept economic sacrifices. In this respect, the Comitia Centuriata transformed war from merely an order to a shared and accepted duty. The voice of the people reinforced the legitimacy of the war and strengthened the citizens' sense of belonging. Voting rights, class differences, and criticisms. Although the Comitia Centuriata was theoretically a mechanism for popular participation, it was sometimes criticized due to its class structure. Especially the concentration of upper classes in fewer centuries allowed them to intervene early in the decision-making process, often resulting in the lower classes not having a real opportunity to influence the final outcome. For example, if the first 97 centuries voted in majority, the votes of the remaining centuries were no longer needed. This situation often rendered the voting rights of the lower classes symbolic. Nevertheless, the Comitia Centuriata ensured that at least a portion of the people participated in such a vital decision as war, distinguishing the Roman Republic from other ancient forms of governance. Legitimate power through the people's decision. The role of the Comitia Centuriata in the process of declaring war is important for understanding how democracy, albeit limited, operated in Rome. The guiding role of the Senate, the religious legitimacy granted by the official priests, and finally the legal approval by the People's Assembly demonstrate that war declarations in Rome went through a multi-layered system of checks and balances. This system, on one hand, upheld the institutional wisdom and religious traditions of the state, and on the other hand, ensured the consent of the people, thus becoming one of the balancing factors that sustained the Roman Republic. Therefore, the Comitia Centuriata was not just an assembly, but represented the shared conscience, approval, and responsibility of the people. Exceptional circumstances and extraordinary powers. The suspension of normalcy, Rome's response to crisis through extraordinary authority. In the political and military history of ancient Rome, the Republic's commitment to laws, traditions, and checks on power was both a source of strength and a potential limitation in times of grave crisis. While Rome prided itself on a complex system of shared governance involving the Senate, the people's assemblies, and religious authorities, exceptional circumstances often demanded extraordinary measures. In such moments, whether facing external threats, internal upheavals, or existential dangers, Rome turned to specific mechanisms and offices designed to concentrate authority temporarily in order to safeguard the state. These exceptional powers highlight the Republic's pragmatic approach to balancing constitutional order with urgent necessities. Nature of exceptional circumstances. In Rome, Rome's political framework was rooted in the principle of lex, law, and mos maiorum, custom of the ancestors, emphasizing a stable and predictable governance structure. However, history demonstrated that emergencies such as wars, civil unrest, or severe crises could overwhelm ordinary political processes. Exceptional circumstances were those deemed too urgent or dangerous for the usual deliberative bodies, requiring swift and decisive action that ordinary magistrates could not provide. In these situations, Rome accepted the suspension or modification of normal procedures, understanding that survival of the state took precedence over procedural rigidity. This acceptance reflected a broader Roman worldview that prioritized salus rei publicae, the welfare of the Republic, above all. The dictatorship, concentration of extraordinary powers. The most famous and institutionalized form of extraordinary power in the Roman Republic was the dictatorship, Dictatura. Instituted as a constitutional office, the dictator was appointed by the consuls, with the Senate's consent, for a limited period, usually 6 months, and tasked with addressing the specific emergency at hand. Scope and limits. Unlike regular magistrates who shared power with various checks, the dictator wielded nearly absolute authority within the scope of his mandate. This allowed him to bypass lengthy debates or legal obstacles, mobilize resources effectively, and command the army without the usual constraints. Temporary and purpose-driven. The office was explicitly temporary and purpose-driven, meant to restore stability and then relinquish power back to the Republic's normal institutions. This ensured that the extraordinary powers did not evolve into permanent autocracy. Historical examples. Figures such as Cincinnatus, who famously relinquished his dictatorship promptly after resolving a crisis, symbolized the ideal Roman approach to extraordinary power, effective yet humble and temporary. Other forms of extraordinary authority. Besides dictatorship, the Republic could also grant extraordinary imperium to magistrates such as consuls or proconsuls during extended military campaigns. This imperium superseded normal authority limits, allowing them to act swiftly in war zones without constant Senate oversight. Additionally, Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the final decree of the Senate, was a Senate resolution used to grant magistrates the authority to take any measures necessary to protect the Republic, effectively suspending normal legal constraints during crises such as rebellions or internal disorder. The balance between authority and liberty. Rome's mechanisms for extraordinary powers illustrate its nuanced understanding of governance. On one hand, it acknowledged that the concentration of power was dangerous and antithetical to Republican ideals. On the other hand, it recognized that rigidity in times of crisis could be fatal. Thus, the Republic embedded strict temporal and legal limits on extraordinary powers and maintained symbolic oversight, ensuring that such powers were seen as tools of the state, not personal prerogatives. This delicate balance was not always perfectly maintained. There were instances where extraordinary powers were abused or prolonged, contributing to Rome's eventual transformation from republic to empire. Yet, for much of its history, Rome's constitutional system successfully integrated emergency powers without undermining its core values: exceptional powers and military necessity. The military dimension was central to the granting of extraordinary powers. Rome's frequent wars required leadership that could respond rapidly to shifting circumstances. The dictatorships and extraordinary imperium allowed for decisive military campaigns, free from the delays of political negotiation. However, these powers were often accompanied by religious and legal rituals to reinforce their legitimacy, such as auspices taken by commanders, or the ratification of war declarations by the Senate and the people. These formalities ensured that even extraordinary powers operated within Rome's deeply embedded sense of law and divine order. Pragmatism in crisis, commitment to order. Rome's approach to exceptional circumstances and extraordinary powers reveals profound pragmatism. While the Republic was built on principles of shared governance, legalism, and tradition, it never allowed these principles to become obstacles to survival. By creating constitutional means to temporarily centralize authority, Rome safeguarded its stability in moments of peril without permanently sacrificing its republican character. This dual commitment to order and flexibility helped Rome navigate centuries of warfare, social challenges, and political turmoil, leaving a legacy of governance that continues to influence modern ideas about emergency powers and constitutional limits.